This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
A little self-care can go a long way, especially amidst the hustle and bustle of the holidays. That's where Vegamore comes in. Trusted by millions, Vegamore is all about giving your hair the love and care it deserves. With their vegan and cruelty-free formulas, you can nourish and revitalize your strands while indulging in some much-needed pampering. Because let's face it, who couldn't use a bit more me time this time of year? Go to vegamore.com/ACAST, code ACAST. That's vegamour.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Demetrios Matheou, who is a film critic and a author. He has written a book on new South American cinema for Faber, but today we're going to be talking about his new BFI Classics book on Mean Streets, Martin Scorsese's breakthrough film, not his first film, but his breakthrough film certainly, which was released 50 years ago. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to like and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY, or Instagram, the same handle. But before you do any of that, enjoy the conversation. What's your relationship with those BFI books? Are you have you been an ardent reader in the past?
I wouldn't say ardent, but a little bit like you. I think they've always been in my life in a sense. I've kind of I've come by them now and again almost by chance. I might be in the BFI library, or I might want to read more about a particular film and target one of them. But I've just always been aware of them, and I've got a bunch at home. When I started writing this one or thinking about this one, we were in the first lockdown of the pandemic, and apart from looking at my bookshelves generally to see what I had on Scorsese, it was obviously, this has caught me a bit unawares. What have I got of the BFI classics? And there were a bunch. So I think they've always kind of been in my life, and I've got a few favourites. And in an odd kind of way, I've got a few favourites that have become almost as famous and kind of integral as the films themselves. I will often, just as often as I'll watch Bringing Up Baby, I'll read the really good BFI classic on BFI Baby. On Bringing Up Baby. It's a wonderful read, and it can be as evocative of the film as the film itself.
Adrian Martin's Once Upon a Time in America, I've returned to several times, and as you say, almost as it's almost like, also because Once Upon a Time in America is so long, it's probably takes less time for me to read his book than it does to watch the film. What's your relationship with Scorsese then?
Well, I mean, on one level, it's the same as anybody else's. You know, he's, the awareness of the fact that he's, a fantastic filmmaker and always an interesting filmmaker. And, even if, I don't think he's on form, he's interesting. So on that very general level, he's part of, the canon that I've kind of grown up with. On a more personal level, I remember Taxi Driver was probably in some respects the first kind of adult film I saw, and I saw it on the sly with an older cousin. I think I was like 15 or something, and sneaked me in, and kind of watched it from the back. And so, my first Scorsese experience was literally having my kind of mind blown away by Taxi Driver in a kind of illicit way, in a sense. But from there on, I think, his to my mind best films are amongst my favorite films. So Taxi Driver means a lot. Raging Bull, as soon as I saw it, bang, it's always in my kind of lists, and I just think it's a majestic and extraordinary film. And so when he touches me, it's on a kind of visceral level, a level that sticks. So, there are 4, 5, 6 films of his that, are kind of like in my film viewing DNA, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that thing about actually seeing it on the big screen as a first time way of seeing Scorsese as well must have been something incredible.
It was just extraordinary. The mood and the tone. I think, whenever I see it again, whenever you see it, this is now Taxi Driver, but there's similar scenes in Mean Streets. But when I see again the taxi driving through the streets at the beginning of the film, it takes me all the way back to that kind of first kind of visceral, almost life-changing, experience. And the shootout at the end of the film, the kind of Grand Guignol scene, was, like a early introduction to violence on screen for me, because I was pretty young, but also, which is what he's so good at, it made sense to me that there was a psychological element to this, to the man who, to the violence. Really kind of rammed home. I thought about that for such a long time afterwards. But there are scenes that have, but again, I'm so sad that the first time I saw Mean Streets was on VHS, because it was when I was older. It was a case of, well, let's look up some Scorsese that I haven't seen. And because I would have loved to have experienced, that first scene or the whole sequence really in Volpe's, but when De Niro enters, when the camera first enters Volpe's, and it kind of dollies along the bar, and you see all these extraordinary figures, and it's all doused in red. And then a few minutes later, when De Niro walks in, and and to Jumping Jack Flash, and it kind of cuts between him and Keitel and back again, and the camera's doing all these different things, and the speed changes, but that's the kind of moment that, that's like real cinema to me. And I really wish I'd seen it for the first time on big screen rather than on VHS. But it really whacked me when I saw it on video as well.
Yeah, in the book you mention it as one of the sort of like that's one of the awe-inspiring moments of cinema for you.
I think it is, yeah. And also, since we're talking, and maybe, my favorite kind of scene by Scorsese. The people always, when they talk about the definitive, Scorsese moments, and I do say this in the book, but they mention the Copacabana scene in Goodfellas and what the camera's doing there, and it's amazing. And also another wonderful and one for me is the boxing scenes in Raging Bull, and especially the first one, in slow motion and everything. And they are definitive. But this one, that one in Mean Streets is up there with those, I think. For the way that it introduces characters, that sequence and the way it cuts between Keitel and De Niro, it tells you so much about the relationship and the dynamic between those characters. Also, I mean, okay, we've already seen De Niro blow up the mailbox. I don't know if in that first glimpse of him when he kind of throws a firecracker or whatever it is in the mailbox. But that aside, this is the introduction to the Scorsese-De Niro partnership. When he walks into that bar with the two women on his arm, grinning like a Cheshire cat. It's an iconic moment.
Absolutely, and he's just so confident and so full of sass. It's and the music, the running sense. I mean, kind of another point, but how did Scorsese get all these songs? Because nowadays the soundtrack would sink the budget of an entire movie for this film.
And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I think they just managed it. I know that he used some songs in Mean Streets that he couldn't use in Who's That Knocking at My Door, his first film. I think probably it was generally, or certainly cheaper then. But also his producer was Jonathan Taplin, who, used to be the manager for Bob Dylan and the band. I don't know for a fact, but just maybe his kind of music connections smoothed the way for some of those. I suspect it was a bit of both. And also I suspect maybe because so much of the film was made on the cheap, I suspect that, if they were sitting down and prioritizing here and there, it might have been on the music rather than locations and things.
And I mean, talking about that cheapness, he gets hell of a lot of bang for his buck, like the cherry bomb that goes in the mailbox, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, he said something like the economy dictated the style, and the style just happened to work. And I think that's really perceptive. I think some of the positive quality of the film kind of comes from the rawness and that you get when you're doing it fast. And he was using students in New York. I don't know. The shoot was split between LA and New York. I mean, for one of the kind of definitive New York films, it's interesting that more days were in LA. They did, broadly speaking, they did the interiors in LA and the exteriors in New York. And in LA, he used the Roger Corman crew that he'd had on Boxcar Bertha, so like a professional crew, but again, one that was, Corman was all about bringing things home on as tiny a budget as possible. They were all about pragmatic filmmaking. But in New York, they used students. So it was, I mean, I wonder, I don't know if they talked about guerrilla filmmaking back then, but maybe it would have been a little bit like that. There was certainly one famous scene when they're shooting on the streets of New York where they did lose a whole reel of film that had all of De Niro's close-ups on it. But anyway, I think the that rawness and kind of gritty efficiency is what we see on screen. I think it works. But again, for you, it is a lot of bang for your buck.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that I've noticed rewatching Mean Streets in preparation for this discussion, and it's something I noticed watching Taxi Driver relatively recent as well, is there's not that much sort of what you'd normally ascribe to low budget independent aesthetic that maybe you'd see today, such as sort of like handheld camera, over the shoulder shots. He uses lots of quite complicated shots, and he wants to put the camera on a tripod when he gets the chance. He wants to keep it steady when he can.
Well, I think he actually mixes it up.
Exactly, yeah.
And he mixes it up, and again, what's lovely is you kind of feel as though the film is keeping you on your toes. I mean, and you're right. You can't watch it expecting to see an indie film with entirely in handhold and raggedy camera and all of that. The early scene in the church is again, as you suggested, it has a lot of really quite interesting shots and cuts in it. It really mixes it up. But I mean, the shots are quite classical and steady, but very dynamic and very interesting. But then you've got other scenes which, they didn't have, Steadicam didn't exist then, but they had something called the Aeroflex BL, which I think some of the French directors were using. So it's as lightweight as they were going to get. And Kent Wakeford, the cinematographer, kind of created a rig for himself, a kind of shoulder rig, I think. So he was carrying it a lot in the pool room scene, the famous pool room scene. I mean, that's, effectively handheld camera. So, and some of the bar scenes are, but he kind of mixes it, I think. Oh, but again, the restaurant ones are more classical. I think what he's, maybe, and I suspect that some of the approach was kind of pragmatic. What shall we use given the time we've got? They did the pool room scene, which is incredibly complicated, in 16 hours. So you're not going to set up loads of track and stuff for that. But in the restaurant scene and again, those scenes were about power. The more kind of Godfather-like scenes where you're trying to kind of where he's kind of making it very clear who's got the power in the room, then it makes sense to have, static shot, frame it, and all of that. So there's a lot of variety in the film, in short.
And I mean, it's interesting you bring up. There's a couple of things in the book that I was really sort of question marks. One mistake I always make about Mean Streets is I always think of it as his first film, and of course it's like his third, I think. Yeah,
third, yeah.
And that's sort of but it feels like a first film for some reason. And I've seen the others as well, so there's no excuse for my stupidity. But
it's very much the first in the sense that, two reasons. One, I think it's the film in which all the work he'd been doing, all the studying, formal studying and informal, film, intense cinephilia studying that he'd been doing since he was a kid, but all of the work, all the study he'd done, and he'd made shorts. Who's That Knocking on My Door was a personal film, but very much it was kind of like quasi. He started it when I think it was a postgrad film, and then took several years to finish. So that was personal, but in no real kind of, you might say, professional context. Then he made Boxcar Bertha for Corman, which was an exploitation film. So it wasn't a personal film at all, but he was working with professional crews who really knew what they were doing, and I think taught him a lot. And he learned a lot. And most of his crew on Mean Streets was that Boxcar Bertha crew. So he had the professional experience in one film and the personal storytelling in another film. And what Mean Streets did was put those together. I think it's the first film because it's when he really found his voice and it all clicked. He was making the film he wanted to make. And the other reason it's the first film is because it's like a calling card film. It's the one that, when it opened at New York Film Festival, kind of blew everybody away. And Pauline Kael, immediately championed it, which obviously was very important. Other producers started to take notice. He'd shown an interest in directing Taxi Driver before Mean Streets came out, but the producers didn't really think, that he had the chops for it. He was a young, unknown, relatively inexperienced director, but when they saw Mean Streets and De Niro, they figured those two guys could make Taxi Driver. So, in a way, it launched him. So you're not wrong in a sense.
Yeah. Sometimes my stupidity manages to get to a deeper truth. And the other thing that I hadn't really thought about, but is this debate or its relationship, the film's relationship with the gangster movie? Because you make a good argument for it not necessarily sitting too comfortably as just a pure gangster film, because it's, there's more of a character study. There are gangsters there. They're part of the neighborhood. But then at the same time, it does have a relationship with the antecedents of Warner Brothers gangster films and also Coppola's Godfather, which this film sits in between.
Yeah. This is the thing. I think I sometimes think of it as a kind of outlier in the genre, right. But in the same way as, so it's certainly got the milieu. This world is one, it's kind of, Charlie, the main character, he's torn between the church and the mafia, criminality, and Scorsese, himself said, he grew up, amongst the gangsters and the priests. So, the neighbourhood is kind of the actual neighbourhood that he's writing about and showing us is kind of infused with criminality. So that aspect of it is unavoidable. And then I think, there's, he, as a person and as a filmmaker, he was, he'd already imbibed so much cinema, and a lot of it was those kind of, that included, like the Warner's gangster films from the 30s with Cagney, the Roaring Twenties, and Public Enemy, and films like that. So, and I think, I think those kind of films are in his DNA, and socially, some of the issues of those 30s films and later in 40s crime films as well, about people who are, about the underclass who are trying to make a living whichever way they can, is very much in this movie also. And then at the same time, obviously, there's the kind of he and Martin started writing this before the Godfather book was published.
Right.
So it's not that they weren't in any way, I think, informed by the Godfather. But as you say, they do sit quite interestingly side by side, and kind of the comparison almost illustrates what kind of film Mean Streets is, because you might, if the Godfather is all about the kind of mob royalty, the family that runs this massive criminal business. Mean Streets is the kind of, are the foot soldiers, the people who are ducking and diving on the streets. And some of them, like Giovanni, Charlie's uncle, he is a player. He's a mob player. So it's just a different kind of view into that world. But also, as I think you were suggesting, it doesn't really play with any of the familiar tropes. You don't have the machine gun shootout in the streets. You don't have loads of kind of machinations over the dinner table. Who's going to hit who and who's going to do this? The violence is spontaneous, kind of made up on the hoof, in a way. And so, it doesn't play by any of those rules, but it does give you a picture of a criminal world.
And you bring up a point, a film that maybe not many people would recognize. I think it's called Dead End, the Humphrey Bogart film.
Yeah, William Wyler.
Yeah, Lillian Hellman scripted, I think, if I remember rightly. And I mean, just in the sense that it's set in a neighborhood. I mean, that I'm not sure if it's based on a play, but that film's very sort of theatrical in that it's set in one sort of space, really. Yeah,
and I'm not sure it's a film that Scorsese's ever mentioned, not that I've seen anyway. But when I saw it, it did kind of resonate in a way, because it's kind of more kind of by the more on the docks, I think. But it's either one of the first films to feature the Dead End Kids, who were featured in other gangster films, but these literal child actors who always played kind of delinquent ruffians, in the neighborhood. And it's an interesting film because it plays on the kind of class tensions between kind of posh New Yorkers who are trying to gentrify this slum area and the locals who don't want anything, don't want to know about them at all. So on one level, there's a drama and a conflict between these, but then you've got Humphrey Bogart, a child of the neighborhood, who's now a notorious gangster who's on the run, who comes by because he wants to kind of hook up with an old sweetheart. I can't remember whether it's originally to see his mum or his mum and the old girlfriend, but he's kind of, and the young boys kind of revere him, and everybody else just wants him to kind of quit. So, but it's a strong neighborhood film, albeit on sets. It's kind of artificial. It's a very artificial film, but at least it's trying to be authentic. And again, the great thing about Mean Streets and De Niro always is that it is authentic.
Absolutely. And you have it's set during the San Gennaro Festival, which I think is beginning of September in New York, and it lasts about a week or so.
I think it used to be 10 days. I don't know if it still is. Yeah. Which oddly enough is a Neapolitan festival. Scorsese, Sicilian. And his stories, his characters are Sicilian, but it's the biggest festival in the area, and therefore a useful one for him to use. And what's interesting is the whole story takes place during the course of the this religious festival, which as at times I think has also had a gangster connection. I think the local villains were kind of creaming some of the money off the San Gennaro festival, which again tells you about the kind of dynamic between the church and the crooks.
I think there might be an episode in The Sopranos where there's a festival. I'm not sure if it's the same one, but it reminds me of it, that one of the fair rides is, a bit hooky, a bit wrong, and there's an accident, and and of course it's used in Godfather Part 2 where De Niro
exactly.
Is planning another parallel that you bring up. I loved that unity of time as well, because in a way, cinematically, it feels like it could be spending a lot of time. There was a bit when I was watching it where I was thinking, is this another San Gennaro festival? Has a year gone by between these things happening? And I think that's you bring that up by the fact that it doesn't use establishing shots in the way that conventionally film does, and so it does give you a slight sense that things are drifting and you're not quite sure, what the interval between certain things are.
Well, sometimes you feel there's no interval at all in a really charming way. So there's that moment when immediately after the pool room scene, so you've had this huge scene where they go over to another part of town, they argue with these Neapolitans, they have this huge fight, then the police come in and stop it, and then the police leave and they start again. All of this violence and chaos. And it's a way that Scorsese, who edited this himself, does a lot of the editing. It's just like snap, and they just walk straight into the bar, But you can tell that they've just come. It's exactly the same group, other than De Niro. But the huge sense is that they've just got back from the fight. Whereas, in 99% of other films, you would have had, an establishing shot of the bar and maybe a couple of other interim shots, and then they all kind of go into the back room and start another scene. But in this one, it's immediate. And then there are other kind of moments where you haven't seen the festival for a while, and then suddenly up they pop, and you kind of think, okay, well, yeah, there's still, maybe it's just a few days later. We're still in this period, in this kind of this tempo, which I think is really clever. And of course, it ends with the actual final night of the festival. The song that ends the film, the song that they're singing at the end of the film, is the one that traditionally closes the festival. So that's very neat.
I was watching it with my wife Lydia, who's Italian, and we're living in Italy, and she recognized one of the songs and went, "Oh, that's Faccetta Nero," and it was taken by the fascists. It was a fascist song. And I'm not sure if they just adopted it. And presumably, if it's part of a religious festival, they've just adopted it. But I noticed as well in his uncle's luncheonette, there's a big portrait of Il Duce, the Mussolini, in the background as well. So there's also this strand of, you pointed out that they mentioned Lucky Luciano.
Yeah.
So the Italians have American Italians have a history of sort of, we've helped win the war, but also we were on, our mother country was on the wrong side of the war.
Yeah. And I like the fact, it's one of those kind of, you're often getting little glimpses on the wall, on shop windows or inside that luncheonette. There are lots of little posters and glimpses of things that make you realize all of those elements in that culture that all stitch together. The politics, the religion, stuff like that. It's and also on the music. And I wish I knew more about Italian, like folk music, the folk songs that he uses. There were lots, and I couldn't really get behind the consequence, the significance of all of those. Very rich. It's very, very rich soundtrack.
I think that's partly a Catholic thing as well. With the, if you go into a Catholic church, just the amount of detail, it would take you years to just go through a church and study every image, because there's so much in there.
One thing I did, which doesn't find its way in the book, but because I'm not a Catholic, I know very little about the Catholic liturgy or any of it. I sat down in the office very near to finishing when we were kind of stepping out of the pandemic, and we were back in the office, and I've got a colleague who's a Catholic, and I wanted to watch, for example, that opening church scene with a Catholic. I wanted him to tell me what was going on that I might not really quite understand in terms of, the language Keitel was using in his head, the things he was walking past in the church. We talked a lot about sin and redemption. You can read about that, but it makes a difference if you actually sit down and talk to a practicing Catholic about it. You get entirely, and I just wanted to have a better sense, even if it was just for myself, and it wasn't going to find its way into the book, because obviously a big theme of it is redemption.
What I think is interesting about Scorsese's own spiritual journey, if you like, is that his parents aren't particularly observant Catholics, or not at all, as you make the point. And so it's something that he's sort of adopted himself. It's not something he's had sort of placed on top of him. Yeah. So in a sense, even though he's coming from a fairly Catholic background, he's also got a little bit the glee of the convert, who wants to, I was brought up Catholic, and so, I shucked it off as my first available opportunity. But, I have the remnants, no doubt about it. But you do get the feeling that Scorsese, this is something that this is a road he's chosen.
But it's clearly, there's an element to his. I'm not going to psychoanalyze Martin Scorsese, but there's an element to his personality, isn't it? That we know, you and I know, and he's, the nature of his cinephilia is, and his film knowledge, his love of film cinephilia is almost kind of diminishes it. But it's intense. He's clearly, if something engages him, I think it engages him heart and soul 100%. And for whatever reasons, when he was a boy, I suspect, because he was quite young and frail and wasn't the kind of kid who was going to stick up for himself in the playground, he drifted towards the church. And I think for a time in his life, he engaged the church with all of the kind of vigor and passion that we know he engages cinema. And, he was an altar boy for a number of years and did think about, kind of becoming a priest before slowly drifting towards the other passion, which was film. So I think it's part of his nature just to embrace everything, heart and soul.
Absolutely. And when it comes to Harvey Keitel's redemption, he places that in Johnny Boy. And I think you make De Niro's character, and you make a really good point of pointing out that De Niro Johnny Boy doesn't necessarily want to be redeemed. It's not like, I've got to save you, and it's like, from what? From this guy who's, there may be an argument that Charlie's making absolutely everything worse, because if there was no filter between him and Johnny Boy, first of all, Michael wouldn't have lent him so much money, and secondly, Johnny Boy would have got a beating, and that would have been the end of it.
Yeah, and I think in a way it's almost like, nobody thinks of Mean Streets as a mystery, but I think there is a kind of a mystery there. And I think Scorsese at times has acknowledged, not using that word, but acknowledged the fact that we don't really know. I mean, the thing is that Charlie wants to save Johnny Boy in order to redeem himself. What we don't, and on the one hand, as Johnny Boy doesn't want to be saved. On the other hand, there's a question, what really is Charlie seeking redemption for? Is it because, and it's never stated clearly, and I think, and I take that as a good thing, but is it because, he is spiritual in some way, and yet he knows he's working as a criminal, and therefore he has to somehow, kind of work that out for himself? Or, is it because, for me, in a way, sometimes you have these little quiet moments between Charlie and Johnny Boy where you get a sense of what their relationship has been their entire life. There's a scene where they're walking in the street, and I think Johnny brings it up, when they were kind of like jumped on, they were kind of caught by police once, or there was some kind of fracas, and Charlie just left Johnny to it, and Johnny took a big hit, and sometimes you do wonder, how many hits to the head he's taken. And And Charlie just left him, and they acknowledge that in a couple of sentences and move on. And you get there are about 4 or 5 moments like that where you kind of feel that Charlie has let down his friend their entire lives. And maybe that's what he's seeking redemption for. But I like the fact that it's open-ended. And as you say, I like the fact that it actually just makes everything worse and worse. There's right at the end in the last scene in the bar when Johnny Boy pulls the gun and he says, Charlie, you got what you wanted. Now, again, it's a bit ambiguous because we don't know really what he wanted, but it's kind of, we might say, you were asking for that. This is, it's blown up in our faces and it's your fault.
A little self-care can go a long way, especially amidst the hustle and bustle of the holidays. That's where Vegamore comes in. Trusted by millions, Vegamore is all about giving your hair the love and care it deserves. With their vegan and cruelty-free formulas, you can nourish and revitalize your strands while indulging in some much-needed pampering. Because let's face it, who couldn't use a bit more me time this time of year? Go to vegamore.com/ACAST, code ACAST. That's vegamor.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
Absolutely. And I mean, weirdly, there's a sort of inversion of what's happening in that original story, because Charlie's saying, you didn't have to hold off the cops for me to get away. And he said, because I mean, that's how Johnny frames it. I took a beating so you could get away. Yeah, and Charlie's like, I could have got away anyway. You didn't need to do that.
But that's not true. In the pool room, there's that brilliant thing where Charlie is just when Charlie ends his fight. But I think he's basically, although we've got the soundtrack which is drowning everything out, the impression is he's basically saying, "Look, I hurt my hand." He's not a fighter. But whereas Johnny is taking 8 of them on his own.
Standing on the trying to kick them. That's so brilliant. That's De Niro at his classical best. And I love De Niro when he's in one of their very first conversations when they're walking down the street and he ducks behind a car because he sees someone who he owes money to. And it's just like, is he gone? Yeah, he's gone around the corner. Yeah, but is he gone? Because he could have just be waiting around the corner. And in that sense, Johnny Boy knows more about the streets than Charlie does. Charlie's just like, oh yeah, he's gone around the corner, he's gone. Yeah, but that could be a trick.
And actually, you're making me think, because also if I had to choose a favorite scene in the film other than the entrance into Volpe's, which I just think is quite awesome, it would be the conversation between the two of them in the back of the bar about the debt, and the tall tale that he tells about Joey Clams, and the card game. And that's fabulous for so many reasons, but you made me think of it because I think Johnny is much more the streets, and also I think he understands their relationship better than Charlie does. And apparently Scorsese has often said that De Niro felt that there needed to be another scene which explained or showed us the hold that Johnny has over Charlie. And that's a kind of streetwise hold, I think. And so they added that scene, they devised it, and they got an extra day to shoot it at the end of the shoot. And I think it's wonderful for that. You just really understand how these two work together, but particularly from that controlling kind of streetwisey angle.
Yeah, and how fascinated Charlie is by him as well. It's just like, you're telling me bullshit, but at the same time, it's fascinating bullshit. Go on, tell me more.
Yeah, he just laps it all up. And it's very, very funny, and kind of at least semi-improvised, which you can see on their faces. You can see the way that Keitel, but you're not entirely sure whether it's Keitel who's trying to keep up with this Shaggy Dog story or Charlie.
Yeah.
You're really not sure which man is holding on for dear life.
And talking about sort of the relationships, and one of the sparks that will sort of perpetuate the ultimate meltdown is Charlie's relationship with women, and to some degree this is arguably sort of beginning the Scorsese template for how women will be represented and treated in his films, typically for with some very telling exceptions, like Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. You have Teresa, Johnny Boy's, is it Johnny Boy's sister or cousin? Cousin, yes. I thought it was cousin, yeah. And the stripper from the bar.
I mean, that template, it's not a good one, is it? It's not a positive one. The women tend to fare fairly badly in his films, and particularly in the films that he does with De Niro, which is, it's not to obviously denigrate them as human beings, but I think that they're always trying to show the characters that they're, talking about in some kind of realistic light. And, so I think we're not, but this one is, Teresa is, and it's very much part of Charlie's dynamic in the film as well, because he's trying to, he thinks, look out for Johnny, but also he's trying to keep on the right side of his uncle Giovanni. He wants to take over this restaurant, which is about to fall into his uncle's hands. And his uncle doesn't want him to be involved with either Johnny Boy or Teresa. Teresa's kind of part of the neighbourhood, but it's unclear what all the family connections are. But I think that, Giovanni kind of looks down on her family. But also, interestingly, they all look down on her because she wants to leave the neighbourhood. So if you forget for a while how the men treat her, she's an interesting figure, because all these guys are all trapped in this kind of codified, narrow-minded, bigoted world downtown. And she wants to get out of that. She wants to kind of have it, lead her own life, get an apartment uptown. She's trying to persuade Charlie to do that, but she's not getting anywhere. So she's an interesting figure anyway, just because she represents, a desire to escape. But then, yes, Charlie doesn't really treat her particularly well. There's the dreadful scene at the end of the film. Can we do spoilers? I suppose we've been given lots of spoilers. The most terrifying scene in the film, in a way, is at the end when Charlie and Johnny finally go at each other, and Teresa has an epileptic fit. Trying to break them up, it just gets too much, and she has a fit, and Johnny immediately just throws invective at her and walks away. Charlie kind of thinks about it, stays with her for a few seconds, and just follows his mate. It's such a version, of anybody who's having, he should be staying with the person who's in distress, but he leaves her. But also, when we first meet her, when they're in bed together, the language he uses towards her is pretty vile and sexist and narrow. And I mean, in many ways, Charlie is a kind of development of a character from Who's That Knocking at My Door, which Keitel played, called JR. We didn't say, but Scorsese originally conceived a trilogy of a film which was never made, or a script that was never made, called Jerusalem, Jerusalem, and which involved kids. And then there was Who's That Knocking, and then it would be Mean Streets. And JR, the character in Who's That Knocking, is again, it's just somebody who treats his partner very, very badly, treats women very, very badly. And is it because, is it a kind of, I don't want to analyze too much. Is it a Catholic view of women? Is it an Italian view of women? Is it a Roman Catholic view of, is it all of that all together? I don't know.
Is it a 1973 view of women?
I'm sorry, exactly. Is it a 1973 view of women as well? Yeah. Thanks for that. All of that. It's very complicated and not good.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a bit where he's responding to criticism that you quote in the book, where somebody in the New York Times says, why do I want to spend time with these horrible people? And he's like, well, I do. Why should I care about these people? Well, I do. They aren't perfect people. They've. I mean, even Teresa, she's called the C word in one scene, and then she sees a black chambermaid coming out of the hotel, and she treats her disgracefully, and you immediately think, oh, wait a minute, I was feeling sorry for you, and now you're treating this other person badly. So how's that going to work?
That's right. And actually, there are two kind of things to say on that, and I didn't really articulate it particularly well, because I think the problem is that, which we all do, we're viewing, aside from anything else, we are viewing, any film of any period, but we're viewing this film from 1973 through the prism of how we like to treat people today. But what Scorsese is doing, as an artist and a really good filmmaker, it's just showing it exactly as it is. He wants to show give us an authentic. And he's often said that in a way, Mean Streets for him is a kind of act of anthropology. And he wants to show us this world, warts and all, exactly as it is. And one of the reasons that De Niro has always been a good collaborator, one of the reasons with him, is because De Niro, they're not apologizing for their characters. It's funny, isn't it? Because you often hear actors say, we never judge our characters because the minute we judge our characters, that's the end of it. We have to believe in them 100%. And that is sincere. And I think it's a very useful kind of attitude for an actor to take. But it's the Scorsese template for that is another level. The kind of truth telling of his better films, and that's why they're so painful to watch. Raging Bull. When you're watching Kathy Moriarty get bashed every which way in Raging Bull, it's tough. But that's a true portrait of that figure.
Yeah, and I must admit, I watched that film so many different ways as I was growing up. I watched it partly as a sort of like, this is a great, grittier boxing film than Rocky. And then, as I get older and I rewatch it today, I'm like, Jesus Christ, this is just about domestic violence. The boxing's hardly features in my memory of it now. Almost, it becomes something else. It's, I think that's possibly one of the Scorsese films I find the most difficult to reappraise.
Yeah, and actually, when I think of the way we've been talking for the last five minutes or so, it reminds me again of somebody who I make quite a play of in the book, which is John Cassavetes. And on the one hand, I think he's a extraordinary filmmaker. That is quite important to me, but you watch his films and they're hard work, and you particularly, so for example, when you watch a film like Husbands, I think the Husbands is a good one to kind of put into this conversation when we talk about Mean Streets or Raging Bull or whatever, is because the attitude towards women by the men in Husbands is again, it's despicable, and but also, just the whole. The human interaction in a Cassavetes film is so raw and in your face and true to a certain kind of human dynamic, some kind of more distressing human dynamic, that it makes, it's brilliant art, but it's tough to watch.
I think Cassavetes is one of the best filmmakers ever. Yeah. And not necessarily at his worst, but when people are not, when he turns his camera towards certain things, it becomes almost unwatchable on many different levels.
Yeah, apparently, I mean, I'm not quite sure it's true, but apparently, when Keitel made Duelists some years later with Jenny Ranniker, one of his co-stars was Jenny Ranniker. She was in Husbands, and so on her interview of the Blu-ray of Husbands, she talks about chatting with Keitel on the set of The Duelists, when Keitel told her that the cast were asked to watch Husbands a few times during the making of Mean Streets. If true, not surprising.
Yeah, there's definitely, because Cassavetes, you quote that famous thing he said to Scorsese after Boxcar Bertha, well done, you've just wasted a year of your life.
Making a piece of shit, yeah.
No, but tell me what you really think, John. Don't sprinkle it with any hundreds and thousands.
Well, he was clearly in life what he was on film, John Cassavetes. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Doesn't beat about the bush.
Absolutely. So let's get to the end of the movie, which in some ways is that sort of like a classical, what we would see today is a classical 70s ending, where every other film had to finish with a bloody shootout that kind of had to almost come from nowhere as well, had to come from a clear blue sky almost. They're, Teresa, Johnny Boy, and Charlie are trying to escape the city. I'm not sure if they're sort of almost like they're heading back into the city or back into the neighborhood because of they can't seem to find the right road. And then Michael and an unnamed assassin played by Martin Scorsese sort of pull up. So this is all spoilers, and pull up beside them and unleash gruesome violence. I mean, it's arterial blood is flowing by the end of the scene. Yeah, I mean, this is a shocker of an ending. You have a reading for it in the book, which I wanted to sort of explore a little bit further, because you sort of said, oh, this is like the end of it for everyone. Everyone's screwed. Charlie, his career in the mafia might be, crushed by this. Teresa, we don't know she's being led into an ambulance, but she's obviously been badly hurt, and Johnny Boy's probably dead, given that he's been shot in the neck. I was wondering about that Charlie's career in the mafia thing, because I think the mafia might be okay with someone being shot occasionally.
But I think Scorsese said something like, I can't remember now exactly what, but he said something like, they can't go, they would be better off, effectively he said they'd be better off dead, they can't go, their lives, in the community are over, which is what got me thinking in a way, trying to kind of analyze the truth of that, for myself, because, it's an open ending. We can read it how we like. But, there's Giovanni, his uncle, has a line earlier in the film where he says to Charlie, when he's trying to warn him off Johnny Boy, he says, honourable men go with honourable men, and so, arguably Charlie has revealed that he's not, in his uncle's kind of perspective, that honourable. He has fucked up. So whether or not he'd be taken back into the fold, is a moot point. But my other point was that, if he isn't, that would be a good thing. Because they are just trapped here. If he were to be, rejected by his uncle, and was a laughing stock around Little Italy, then maybe he and Teresa could have another life. But it's kind of open ended, which is fine. But one thing I think is worth saying is that because you mentioned that scene as being quite surprising in the context, you said it kind of, it's a violent scene at the end of this film and maybe came out of nowhere, but that was the scene. And that was the real life incident. There was a real life incident like that. That was the starting block for Scorsese wanting to make this kind of story. In the 60s, when he was a student, but still living at home in Little Italy, he had a close run thing like that. He and his mate were being driven around by another guy who was acting all bolshy, and they thought it was a bit, this other guy was being too extravagant. So they got out of the car. And then the next morning, they found out that a few blocks later, that car had been shot upon and another passenger had been shot in the eye. So again, it's always interesting when you, this film is so born out of his own experience, to the extent that when we see a scene that we might feel has been, maybe a little bit pegged on or a little bit added on and doesn't quite fit with the talky confrontations that we've been watching for an hour and a half, actually, it kind of kick-started the movie.
Well, I don't mean to say it's been sort of, I can think of examples where that is the case, where you feel that the denouement has just been put there to sort of spice things up and close things with a bang. But no, I don't mean that. I think Michael has to sort of shit or get off the pot, so to speak. There has to be some sort of confrontation. Johnny Boy is from the first moment a kind of a tragic figure who's not gonna end well. It's just kind of, I think it's similar to Taxi Driver. You feel everything's gonna boil, and he somehow manages to make it boil. Instead of the pot boiling over as you were expecting, he blows up the kitchen.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
It's so big. It's not just they get shot and the car crashes and you hear the car horn. It's really, really extravagantly bloody. Yeah.
But works. I think it works. Do you think it works?
No, I think it works absolutely. I think it absolutely, in fact, again, rewatching the film following the space of some years, I kind of remembered it being more sudden. And it reminded me a lot of Chinatown in that, it's another sort of terrible denouement, but suddenly you're in a street scene that's very recognizable with, this is a place where ambulances exist as well. And there is another part of the city which doesn't care about all this and is just going to pick up the dead and take them to hospitals and stuff. So it's, and I don't know if that's a bad thing or a good thing. So yeah, I think it really works on many, many different levels. And I was reminded of a lot of films when I was watching this again. Danny Boyle's Trainspotting, I thought the introduction of the characters and the way that the narrative is structured was entirely down to the influence of this movie. I mean, I've not seen him comment on it, or I don't remember him commenting on it, but it seems, seeing Johnny Boy walking up the street and blowing up the mailbox, it's like, that's Trainspotting, you know? Yeah.
And I mean, in a way, I kind of felt, when I was thinking about what the influence of this film might be, and, there's the temptation, obviously, to think about the other crime movies, especially crime movies involving foot soldiers, lower echelon opera, all of that. It's tempting to think of the crime movies that might have been inspired by that, and it's very easy to make a list. But what I was more kind of intrigued by, and what I think is more relevant, is just, to think of other kinds of filmmakers, in the years since that I think who have been influenced in the way that they treat characters, the way they treat dialogue, the way they depict neighborhoods, the way they don't adhere necessarily to story arcs, all of that. I think Mean Streets, kind of reverberates across all kinds of, and Danny Boyle is a good example of somebody you wouldn't necessarily think of as being inspired by Martin Scorsese, but maybe it's just like they're in the DNA now.
Yeah, and you see how he's, I mean, the story that you talked about earlier about the lion cubs in the back of the bar is, I've seen that sort of almost stands alone as a vignette that tells you much more about this character who otherwise might just be the barman. And you point out, he's got bandages. Now you know why he's got bandages on his fingers all the time. And I hadn't, I'd just seen the film and I hadn't clicked. And I was like, oh yeah, that's such a beautiful thing without it, obviously not being obvious, because I didn't get it.
Yeah. Arguably it is a film of vignettes. They all stitch together. And actually, again, only briefly going back to things you were saying about the end, they're vignettes, but the editing, it slowly builds and builds and builds and builds. So these little scenes, and there are so many little scenes, and to begin near the beginning, there are lots of kind of like quite a few comic interludes. Something serious is broken up with something comic, but then in arguably the last third of the film, it just drives and drives and drives towards that ending. So although it does seem suddenly shocking, there's been a motor towards it for quite some while, but it's almost like an invisible motor, I think.
Absolutely. David Carradine being shot up in the bar being a particular one that nobody's traumatized about. Nobody's, then you have a really warm discussion about friendship after that.
Because it's violence.
Yeah.
I was watching the film with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and there's a scene where the first scene between Charlie and his uncle. Charlie enters the luncheonette and he says to his uncle, "Uncle, I was there at the shooting the other night." Now my friend has seen, like we have, the film many times, and he immediately kind of chipped in and said, "Hang on a minute, that's too soon. The shooting hasn't happened yet." I said, "No, that shooting hasn't happened, the Carradine shooting." And but I never ever thought that, because as far as I'm concerned, that shooting hasn't happened. This was another one, because there were always shootings. There are always breakout fights. Violence is day to day.
That's so funny. So what? So Demetrios, you've written this BFI Classics, and you wrote as well a book on Latin American cinema, I think.
South American cinema,
yes.
South American cinema,
yeah. What was the difference between those two? Because you've gone from something very general and to something to honing in on a specific film. Did you find that shift, was that difficult to do, or how did that work?
It was certainly different. I mean, it was a while ago now, but so that was a favourite book of new South American cinema. I mean, it was born of my original conversations with Faber were about I was going to do a directors on directing, but then they wanted to broaden out and they'd just done a book on Mexican cinema, which is also why mine is South American and not Latin American. Right. So they just wanted to kind of look at broader, look at regions. So that was different for two reasons. One was it was a whole continent cinema. It was new South American. So it was from the late 90s onwards.
Right.
It was a whole continent cinema, but also in that Faber tradition, we wanted it to be driven by interviews, so, and we're talking about, Walter Salas, Fernando Morales, Lisandro Alonso, and those two in Brazil, Lisandro Alonso and Lucrecia Martel in Argentina, blah, blah, blah. So it involved, I went to Argentina, I went to Brazil, I went to Chile. I caught up with other directors also, on the festival circuit in Europe. It was different so it's different for those two reasons. I mean, it was interview-led. I mean, as a topic, what I didn't really realize until I started going was that all these, it wasn't just about, say, the finance of the film industries in these countries changing and suddenly people having more money and making fun movies. It was all about politics. I realized I was writing a book about a regional cinema, which was also about or continent, but it was also about a continent that was kind of rising out of dictatorship. All these countries, or most of them, were kind of coming out of dictatorships, and so there was a new kind of freedom for filmmakers to make movies. So, in short, very different. That was that broad. Took 4 years, traveling all over the world to interview people. This was one director. Well, on the surface, one director, one film. I didn't interview him. It was all kind of like found material, mostly written during the pandemic. So there were very, very different experiences. But it's interesting because, a film isn't just a film, isn't it? You kind of it broadens out in its own way. Because I started... and also I was commissioned in 2020, but we wanted it to come out this year for the 50th anniversary. So I had a bit of time. So for the first few months, I just treated myself in a way to explore, So the very first things I did was to watch Scorsese's own two documentaries, My Voyage to Italy and Personal Journey Through American Cinema. So I just wanted to get to know him because he was making Mean Streets is a personal movie. So I wanted to get to know Scorsese, and that's partly through his movies. So I watched those documentaries, and then I watched all the films he was featured in his documentaries, which included loads of film noir, loads of gangster movies from the 30s, neorealism. I revisited all of Cassavetes, blah, 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 blah. So in a way, a much smaller book still had quite a broad experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And have you seen his most recent film, Killers of the Flower Moon?
No, I'm going to see that during the LFF.
Right.
Time. So I haven't seen it yet.
Okay.
But isn't it wonderful let's call Mean Streets his first film cheekily, but 50 years after his breakthrough film, 50 years, he's making another one, which is, seems to be lauded to the hills.
And with De Niro, and a woman doesn't get treated very well. So nothing's changed. He hasn't moved an inch. Come on, boy.
Oh, poor man.
I'm joking. So it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you, but I have one last question, Demetrios, which is, could we have a recommended film book from you?
I was thinking about this. I might cheat a tiny bit.
Everybody does. Don't worry about it.
Do they?
Nobody has ever given me one book. Not a single in 127 episodes, not a single person has given me a single.
Okay, but I'm going to cheat in one way. I mean, I mentioned it in a sense. I think when I was talking about the Faber's directors on directing series, so my cheat is to have, although I haven't read all of them, is to have the whole series. Okay,
I'll give you that. That's a bigger cheat than usual.
That's a big cheat, but it's like taking the collected works of Shakespeare on the desert island, isn't it? But I think because I started. I mean, earlier when I said that I was in lockdown and I looked at my bookshelves to think, well, what have I got that I can get started with, and I had, for example, Scorsese on Scorsese, but I had the first edition, which I bought, when it came out. I can't remember that, but I think it was in the 80s or something, and I've had a couple of other editions since. And and the pages were yellow and blah blah blah. And and it's a bit like what we're saying with the BFI classics, but more so. I've always, whether it's Scorsese or Kieslowski or David Lynch or Werner Herzog, it's those books are such a great introduction to filmmakers. And I love the fact, and it goes to what I was saying about investigating mean streets, and also the Latin American, films have contexts, it's biographical context, a national context, a political context. And I love the story. When you read one of those directors on directing, you get all of that. You get all of the background. And I just think it's a wonderful way to kind of enter a filmmaker's world. So I would have all of those.
Excellent. What a great choice. Yeah, I was just thinking about the context earlier when you were talking at the very beginning, and you were talking about that New York Film Festival in 1973 when Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets opens the festival. Terrence Malick's Badlands closes the festival, and in between I think you have Tarkovsky and Werner Herzog has a film there, and it's just reading that program just makes you go, wow. I mean, we've got great cinema happening at the moment and all the rest of it, but 1973 was a vintage year for the New York Film Festival programmers, I think.
I think so. Yeah, it was just fantastic. But this was the kind of environment that Scorsese, that was feeding Scorsese as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Warner Brothers bought both Badlands and Mean Streets and then fucked up the distribution. So because they were distracted by The Exorcist. That was, yeah. So, it's Mark Commode's favorite film, so we've got to like it, I guess. Yeah. I mean, I like The Exorcist, but I watched it recently at the Venice Film Festival, and I thought, this is a great film, but it's like a 4-star masterpiece. It's like, for me, it's just like, I really like this, and I would almost automatically give it 5 stars for how influential it is and for how important it is for the genre and this, that, and the other. But if I'm just watching it in the cold light of day, I would say, it's really good. It's 4 stars. I like it, but I don't love it.
Yeah, no,
yes. I'm going to cut that bit out.
Yeah, we don't want to end on The Exorcist.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. We want to end on Mean Streets with blood gushing from neck wounds.
What we didn't say, I mean, I get the sense you're finished now, but what we didn't say is, and I don't even know if I said it that explicitly in the book. Maybe I did, or I did it, but in different parts of the book. But when we were talking about that last scene, because there were, you've got, when you think of it, you've got Scorsese in the back of a car. And Robert De Niro holding his neck as blood spurts out, both in Taxi Driver. It was in just on that kind of very visual, personal level, directly casting ahead to actually probably the film that made him a worldwide star, which was Taxi Driver.
And also, doesn't De Niro drive a taxi in part of the film? That somebody,
I'm fairly sure it's him. I mean, I've had other people. It's when when Keitel gets a taxi to kind of hook up with hook up's a bad word, but when he's going on this kind of date he's arranged with the dancer from the club, and then has cold feet. I mean, he tells the driver to drive on, and there's a kind of blink and you'll miss it profile. And for me, it's De Niro with a wig, but to be discussed.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Demetrios. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Good fun.
So that was me and Demetrios talking about Scorsese's film, Mean Streets. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I certainly did, and I think Demetrios did too. I hope so. I'm not sure who we've got on next week, actually. I think it might be... Well, no, let's just have it as a surprise. I'm sorry if my intro and outro has been a bit understated, but I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so that's the reason. But I wanted to put out this episode this week because it's a good conversation, and I'm sacrificing my own health for the good of my listeners. I hope you appreciate it. Until next week, take care.
As the days get shorter and the nights chillier, it's tough to keep up your fall workout routine. Thankfully, there's Alo Moves, the app that brings workouts and wellness to the comfort of your home. Join alomoves.com with code ACAST for a 30-day free trial and 20% off an annual membership. From yoga and Pilates to sound baths and meditations, Alo Moves has it all, with classes made to fit every schedule. Find your perfect wellness routine anytime and anywhere with code ACAST at alomoves.com.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.